Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon. I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University, and welcome to Vlog 60, the deficit doctorate. Now let me tell you how we got here. Our last vlog, Vlog 59, explored what is a PhD. So I was exploring the standards and the assumptions and the expectations that we have of a PhD. But what was incredibly interesting is I got some rather remarkable feedback from supervisors after that vlog, exploring why I was focusing on the international standards of a PhD rather than Australian standards or South Australian standards. Well, let me tell you why. You see, a PhD has international currency. When you apply for a job in Finland or Germany or Canada or the United Kingdom or Malaysia, the people on that interview panel need to know that the PhD you receive from Flinders University, the PhD you receive from an Australian university, is of an equivalent standard to their own national systems. So if we lose those standards, if we lose the quality of a PhD, then we might as well close our programs down. You see, we cannot dumb down the doctorate. When you do an interview in Germany, then I need you to go into that interview with full confidence, knowing that the Australian PhD is not seen to be a second-rate PhD. So standards are, of course, everything. But something odd happened while I was recording that vlog in Cairns, and it's never happened before actually. In the middle of the vlog, I started to think, I need to talk about something else in the next vlog that's aligned with this. You see, yes, it's important that we talk about the standards and the assumptions of a PhD, but I also need to talk about you, our PhD students in our programs. You see, I need to recognise your life, your abilities, all the skills, all the knowledges that you bring into our PhD program before you've even been supervised. So this week we're going to talk about the deficit model for teaching and learning, the deficit model of supervision, and how that impacts on your PhD. So let's start with the basic question. What is the deficit model of teaching and learning? This model of learning starts with the ideology that students are lacking. You come to us as an empty cup and we fill you with our knowledge. So you require a teacher, a master, a mistress to fill you up with expertise and with knowledge that you are lacking. So the deficit model of teaching and learning is a model of lack. The deficit model, though, particularly impacts on students who differ from the supposed norm. So we all have pathways, assumptions about what is the normative or normal way in which a student enters a university and indeed enters a PhD program. So the deficit model suggests that something is wrong with the student coming into the PhD program that doesn't fill into those normative assumptions. So those who haven't had the life experience that seem to be synergetic with the PhD, they're framed as problematic, in need of remedial assistance to reach them to their standards. So this is problematic. It's always been a problematic model of thinking about teaching and learning, but it's particularly problematic right now in doctoral programs because we've never had such a diversity of students in PhD programs around the world as we do right now. So we need a better way of understanding doctoral education beyond Biggs's statement about blaming the student. Sometimes, indeed most of the time, the reason that a student fails a PhD or leaves a PhD program has nothing to do with their intelligence and nothing to do with their motivation. You see, it's about the transmission model of education. And let's be honest, the transmission model of communication has been critiqued for 50 years. The notion that I have knowledge and I will simply pour it into you, the transmission model of teaching and learning. That's always been problematic, and it's particularly problematic in doctoral education. But the consequence of this model for you, for our students, is all the knowledge that you bring to us before you've enrolled a day in a PhD program is rendered irrelevant, not important, and it's marginalised. So what happens in this model is your supervisor becomes the master. Yes, the Jedi master. And you become the Padawan. You become the apprentice to this model, and we fill you up with knowledge. We ignore who you are as a person. So this is a complete disaster in terms of teaching and learning for many reasons. Firstly, this model actually blocks the capacity for you to learn. Now, I've always had a teaching rule, whether I teach first year students or PhD students, and that rule is start where the student is rather than where I want them to be. So if we don't have a recognition of who you are as students before you enter this program, then that's not only offensive, but it's actually ridiculous. If we have this deficit model, we are stopping you learning. You see, what the best of learning does is it takes your expertise and discovers andragogical strategies to use that expertise, use that knowledge, and enmesh it into disciplinary knowledge, disciplinary expertise. Okay, so that's the deficit model. But there's a bigger problem here, a bigger problem. The ignorance and the marginalisation of student knowledge particularly impacts on our candidates who are already discriminated against in the rest of their lives. So we're talking about Indigenous students, international students, students of colour, women, students with an impairment, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender students, and also, of course, students of differing ages. So those assumptions of learning, nay, those assumptions of supervision, can result in a heteronormative, procreative, ageist, misogynist, ableist environment. We perpetuate that as the norm. And what that does is that squeezes out alternative views from a university, but it also squeezes out a whole group of people in our culture. So think about how much of doctoral education is highly normative. We have an assumption about a PhD student, and the best way to show this to you is if you do a Google Images search for a PhD student, what images pop up? Young white men in a lab. So when we search for the images of a PhD student, that is the PhD student that appears. And yes, at Flinders we're fantastic, young white men in a lab, and you are tremendous and I adore you all. You're fantastic. But you're not the majority of our PhD students. You're not the norm against which our other PhD students are measured. You see, such assumptions about what is a PhD student hurts profoundly individual students, but also blocks us from making radical changes in what we think of as supervision. Barbara Lovitz, in a fantastic book titled Leaving the Ivory Tower, presented a startling and a horrifying statistic. And this statistic keeps me awake at night, every night. And this statistic is 50% of the students who commence a doctoral program do not finish it. I'll say that again, 50% of the PhD students who start a doctoral program do not finish it. Now that's sort of the international standard. It varies per institution and national model, but it does focus the mind, doesn't it? The problem with that model though is 50% don't finish, and yet every single student that leaves the program is configured as an individual failure. Right, so Lovett describes this as, quote, the invisible problem. And that invisible problem is the students who simply leave our programs. But this invisible problem is caused by the deficit model of teaching and learning in doctoral education. Because, hang on to yourself, the attrition rate for racial minorities and women is higher than the attrition rate for white men. Wow. Okay. Now, the research is showing that the completers of a PhD and the non-completers of a PhD are equally academically talented. So it's not about ability. So why are those students leaving our program? Big question. The solution that we as universities should implement is to assume, and too often I think we assume that attrition is caused because we select the wrong students. So if we just tighten up our selection process, we tighten up who we let into our program, then the attrition rate will magically go down. Well, you know what? Universities have done that over the last 20 years. We've tightened up our selection protocol, have more and more barriers to get into a PhD student program, because if it gets more prescriptive, then the attrition rate will go down. That's wrong. As we've got more and more and more selective, actually the attrition rate has gone up. And that's because our institutional supervisory strategies have not changed. So what's happening is we've maintained the deficit model. So why have we allowed this to be proliferated? Why have we allowed each individual student to have that individual sense of failure rather than thinking, right, there is a structural problem occurring in our institutions that we have to address? So you notice what happens if we keep blaming individuals, then the university system is never to blame. The individual simply didn't work hard enough, didn't have the ability, all the excuses that we use, rather than the institution, the international higher degree sector assessing the impact of a deficit model on our PhD students and programs. And of course, students take this on. What happens is our students do blame themselves. So they're not good enough. And all the stuff that I see from all the wonderful students that contact me from around the world, all the manifest symptoms that you discuss, like stress, feelings of inadequacy, that imposter syndrome stuff, and also a whole series of health concerns, particularly mental health concerns. For me, all those characteristics are actually proxies that a deficit model of teaching and learning and supervision is in place. So, how do we create a socially, culturally, intellectually just environment in our PhD programs? Well, the first thing is to assume and remove the assumption, really, that the supervisor is God. The supervisor is a deity, the supervisor is Yoda, the supervisor is the carrier of all knowledges. We are supervisors, we're ordinary people. You know, there's all sorts of things I do in life that are pretty good. I have a lot of problems managing my refrigerator. I'm not a god, I can't manage my fridge properly. So remember, you are writing this thesis for two people. You are writing your thesis for examiners. You are not writing your PhD for your supervisors. The one thing I can guarantee to you is that your supervisors will not be your examiners. Okay? So we need to remember, following on from Biggs, that learning is a way of interacting with the world. Learning is a way of interacting with the world. It's not your supervisor's way of interacting with the world. It is your way of interacting with the world. Therefore, supervisors are present to help you learn. And therefore, to help you learn, we have to understand you first. We have to understand your world, your worldview. And then, once we understand you, we can connect your worldview with the disciplinary expertise and the standards we expect of a PhD. So think about the impact of removing the deficit model from supervision, from teaching and learning. All of a sudden, we can recognize the great expertise, the great knowledge that our students bring to our program, to our universities. Let me give you a couple of examples if I can. My wonderful husband Steve supervised what we believe is the first transgender PhD student in the world a couple of decades ago. This student proposed and researched new laws for England and Wales to guarantee the rights of transgender people. This student changed law and changed the world through their PhD research. But he also suffered incredible abuse, so did his family. They had excrement put through their letterbox. His partner was spat at in the street. And even Steve got a fair amount of heat from his colleagues by allowing, quote unquote, those kind of people into a PhD program. Now, we as supervisors can be supervising these wonderful people and think, oh, right, well, this is just supervision as normal. We can suggest that this student might be in deficit. They're not quite managing the standards we expect of a PhD. And actually, what's happening in the rest of their life is irrelevant. Or, we could recognise the gift that socially diverse students bring to our PhD programs. When we do that, though, we have to recognise the discrimination and the prejudice and the social injustice that many of our students confront on a daily basis, and that will change how we supervise them. If we can create a more fluid understanding of teaching and learning and supervision, then our knowledge can be transformed. You see, good supervision is more than the transmission of knowledge. It's supervising the whole person, and it's listening. And when we listen, we create a customised and bespoke series of strategies to enable high quality research. So I'm not undermining or undervaluing excellence here. My life, my career has been based on affirming excellence in teaching and learning. But what I am suggesting today is that we can maintain standards without standardization. 1/4 of the PhD students that I've supervised have been gay and lesbian. They've come out during the PhD supervision. 1/10 of my students have been Indigenous students. And of course, we know in Australia the proportion of Indigenous PhD students is well below the proportion in the population. Now, what we do with that statistic, if we had a deficit model, we'd make some statements about why that's happening. A lot of them would involve racism and meta-racism about Indigenous people in this country. But a socially just model would suggest, you know what? Australian universities have not decolonised, and we're maintaining a deficit model in doctoral education. And when we decolonise the doctorate, then our institutions will be worthy of our Indigenous students enrolling in them. That's important. 1/4 of my PhD students have been postgraduates of colour, and 5 of my completed PhD students have been over the age of 65. Now, the reason I've told you that is those students have given me a great gift, so many gifts actually, but one great gift is I have no single model in my head about what my PhD students look like, what my PhD students are. So the Tara Brabazon cohort of PhD students, there is no sociology there. It's diverse, it's interesting. Of course, they're all brilliant and fabulous, but that's a whole other story. So it's been difficult for me to develop a deficit model, even implicitly in my head. But the great gift of supervising a diversity of students like this is that my wonderful group of students have gone on to teach tens of thousands of students around the world. They've produced books, articles, consultancies that have transformed the world. And through their leadership roles right now, they have enabled and created a huge access pathway for a diversity of students. They have paid that forward. It is amazing, though, what happens if we create this inclusive, socially just model of teaching and learning and supervision, rather than looking for weakness, rather than looking for deficit. And I'll give you an example here, my final example. One of my former students, her name is Dr. Debbie Henley. Hi, Deb, love to Gordon. Debbie was an executive officer for an executive dean in a university in this country, and she wanted to complete a PhD. Like many professional staff members in our universities, she was seen to be not terribly important and simply there to service the needs of the academics. But this remarkable woman, nearly 15 years ago now, wrote one of the most startling PhDs I've ever supervised on women in Australian rules football. It was stunning. Went through as 3 1s. Amazing PhD. And that became a book. And Debbie has gone on to be an activist, to look at arts-led strategies to enable sport and museum exhibitions about women in AFL. And her commitment, her agitation, her activism to think about women in Australian rules football has been in the long term and has made a difference in this country. And this year, for the first time, of course, we had the national competition for women in the AFL. And without Debbie's PhD and her activism in the subsequent 15 years, we may not have got there. Amazing. You see, Deb understood from her professional life what it was to be overlooked and underestimated and marginalised. But instead of her accepting her lot as a professional staff member, she showed great courage, guts, and wrote the key first argument in this country about women and Australian rules football. She looked at the history and she provided the future trajectories for policy work. So when I think about supervisory excellence, when I think about what a great supervisor is, my answer is often quite different from a lot of the policies around the world. I look for the men and the women who create space. Space for difference, space for social justice, that listen to our students and create a journey for these students to success. It's only when we think about our PhD students as already full, as already accomplished, as already remarkable at the start of their candidature that they don't need us as supervisors to make them complete. They're whole before they begin with us. At that point, our job transforms. We're not fixing these students. We're enabling their success for the next moment of their life. This is what I call supervision. The key is in the word, supervision. Seeing the gift that our students can bring to knowledge and enabling those gifts to reach the standards required of an internationally rigorous PhD. No deficit here. None. Just an opportunity to render our universities more socially just. This will transform the knowledge around us. It will transform this nation. So for me, as a favour to your old dean this week, do something for me. Remember who you are. Remember how extraordinary you are. Remember all the gifts and the knowledge that you brought to this PhD program. You are a great gift to this university because you are creating new knowledge. And you're creating new knowledge because of who you are, rather than in spite of it. As always, I wish you love, light, and peace. Tia.